Welcome to Documentary Storytelling Part 2. This is Part 2 of our 3-part course, and today we'll be focusing on production, where we'll finally get to create content. So let's get into it. I shared this quote in our pre-production course, and I'll continue reminding you of this quote as we progress through these video courses. Marketing is no longer about the stuff that you make, but about the stories you tell. In the ministry sector, it would read, marketing is no longer about your services or your statistics, but about the stories you tell. God is at work in your ministry transforming lives. And the opportunities to tell a beneficiary story, one that will engage with audiences, are endless. Those are the stories that will engage with audiences and garner that emotional engagement and response that we've talked about so often. So let's tell those stories. Rather than traditional ministry marketing videos that talk about your ministry's history or your ministry's strategies and statistics around your causes, give testimony to what God is doing through your organization. It's going to bring Him glory and your ministry support. All right, in this video part 1 course, we focused on the pre-production stage of our documentary storytelling process. And we spent that entire course discussing our pre-production process. And only now, in this stage 2 or production stage, are we finally going to be picking up our cameras to go and create content. And if we've done our job right in the pre-production process, we should have a pretty solid plan laid out for capturing what we need in this stage 2 production stage. Now, before we go any further, I want to highlight a setting in your camera that you're going to need to be aware of specifically in regards to video. When video is captured in your camera, it's essentially taking a bunch of photos consecutively and smashing all those photos together to create a moving picture. Now, how many images that are taken within a second is called your frames per second, or FPS. And you're gonna have to decide what setting you want your camera capturing video at. 24 frames per second is a great starting point and the standard for most video. It's going to give your footage a really nice natural look, natural film look. 60 frames per second is an option that's available in most cameras these days, and that can be good for scenes that have a lot of motion. 60 frames per second will separate that motion a little bit more clearly for the audience. And then there's 120 frames per second. Not all cameras offer 120 frames per second, but if yours does, that's going to be used for slow motion primarily. Your camera will capture more frames in a second than can be used really well once you slow the footage down in post-production. So depending on the setting you choose, that's going to determine the shutter speed that you set your camera at. If you choose 24 frames per second, which will be the case in most instances, you'll want to set your camera's shutter to about double your frames per second. Obviously, 24 times 2 is 48, so it's not exact, but 1/50th of a second is the closest you can get with your shutter to doubling 24 frames per second that we have. If you've set your frames per second or your FPS to 60 FPS, you'll set your shutter speed to 1/120th of a second, and so on. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule, but try to follow this rule when you can and when the light allows for it. It's going to help your footage look a lot better. And this is specifically around video. If you want to learn other details and skills with manual camera usage, you can go and take a look at our advanced photography course, where we dive into a lot of the other manual and advanced settings that your camera offers. But this is a specific setting for video that I wanted to highlight. All right, the first step in the production process is shooting the interview. If you'll remember back to the pre-production stage in video part 1, or our documentary storytelling pre-production course, we spend time planning out and prepping for our interview. And in this step in the process, we will actually start shooting the interview. And I'm going to walk you through a couple things to keep in mind while you shoot. Here's one to note to keep in mind before we get started. You'll want to do your best to shoot the entire interview in a single session. It'll help with congruency and consistency in story, and you'll deal with a lot less bouncing around and finding your place in the story once you get into the post-production process. It's important to keep in mind, the interview should always be the first thing you shoot in the production process, as it's going to determine the B-roll and the recreation or drama scenes that you'll need later in the process. The first thing we want to focus on in the production stage of the process is finding out location. Remember, we're coming from the pre-production process with ideas on location. Now it's time to settle on a location and set up for the interview. We want to ask a couple questions when deciding on a location. What is the story about? Remember, we're assuming in these courses we are telling a single character-driven beneficiary story. So it might make the most sense to interview the character in their home or a setting that's personal to the character. If the story was about their role in the ministry, or if maybe the story was specifically focused on your ministry, you might want to conduct interviews in an environment related to your work. We want to look for locations that offer depth and visual interest. Stay away from placing your interviewee up against a wall or a flat surface. We want to look for locations that offer good lighting and consistent lighting. Indoor locations near windows and doors can be great for interviews if you can find spots with enough separation from the background. Outside can be difficult for interviews because the light is always changing. So if you do interview outside, try to stick to a shaded spot that you know will be shaded for the length of the interview. It's also helpful to find spots with leading lines that can point to the subject in the frame. We also want to look for spots that are quiet. Rooms indoors that have furniture can work well to reduce ambient noise. And then lastly, areas with foot traffic in the background or tree leaves slightly blowing in the wind in the background can be great spots. That movement isn't too distracting from the interview, and it can serve to increase visual appeal. In the pre-production course, I encouraged you to stick to the interview questions PDF that we've designed and offered on our website. That remains true here. We're not going to go into detail on the specific questions and the structure because we provide that resource and we've walked through the structure in other courses. The interview questions resource is going to help you pull the full story from your subject. So in this course, what I want to do is quickly highlight a couple of things to keep in mind during the interview. First, always have the interview say and spell their name and say their title or their role within the organization. Second, your interview questions should follow a structure. Again, we encourage you to simply stick to the structure laid out in our interview questions resource. And then third, allow for surprises. In the pre-production stage, we've already outlined the story. But once you start shooting and asking questions, the subject might start revealing things on camera that weren't offered up in the initial conversations. So follow up on things that they say that seem interesting. You might find pieces of the story that maybe you hadn't planned for, that give greater depth to the story. You might also find a completely new direction for the themes and the message you thought you were going to be communicating. Be open to the possibility that your pre-production plan might get completely altered or transformed. It's often in these interviews that God reveals nuances and depth to how He's moved in the interviewee or the beneficiary's life. And the fourth, during the interview, don't make any sounds of agreement or interjections while they are answering. These will interfere with the audio, and they could cause the interviewee to trip up or awkwardly pause in the middle of a sentence. Simply nod your head if you need to make some sort of encouraging signal to the interviewee. Fifth, once the interviewee finishes an answer to a question, always give a few seconds of silence. They might have more to say, but they are simply taking a moment to pause and think through their next sentence. And then lastly, encourage the interviewee from the beginning to include the question in part of their answer. You can remind them of this every time you ask a new question. You can do this by saying something like, "How is the weather?" And please include the part of the question in your answer. This will ensure their response is, "The weather is sunny," rather than sunny. By including part of the question in the answer, the interviewee is including context for the audience without requiring the interviewee or the interviewer's question to be voiced over in the film. Now, in the event your character doesn't speak English, you're going to want to have a translator on scene and off camera, but close enough to where the camera can pick up the translator's audio really well. When it comes to translation, there are a couple things to keep in mind. As you work through your questions, allow for translation after every answer your beneficiary gives. Don't ask a new or a follow-up question until the answer has been translated. This is going to help significantly in the editing process. Ensure that you have someone translating on scene while the interview is taking place, while the cameras are rolling, so that you don't have to worry about the subtitles and the translation back home. The last piece of advice I want to share in regards to interviews is shooting with multiple cameras. Shooting with multiple cameras can be a great way to mix up options in your editing process. Now, if you're gonna only got one camera, please don't hear me say that you have to have two cameras in order to do an interview. You can still create a great film with a single camera. But multiple camera angles during an interview can help provide options in the editing process and give a variety to the interview. Once we start talking about B-roll, you'll hear me encourage you to get close, medium, and wide shots. When you're shooting an interview, you're going to want to focus on medium and close shots. Generally speaking, it's best to set your primary camera up with a medium shot showing the character, waist and chest up, like we have here. And your second camera should be in the tight, uptight and maybe chest up or neck up, maybe even closer like we have in this camera to the right. The closer you get to the camera or the character, the more intimate the shot will feel to the audience. More often than not, I like my second camera to be neck up. That's usually plenty close, and there's always options to crop in tighter in post-production if it becomes necessary. And that is my advice for the interview in the production stage. Now that we've shot your interview, we can start working on B-roll and the drama scenes if those are relevant to the story that you're telling. So let's move into the supporting content phase of production. Now, all documentary films need supporting content. Otherwise, the film will be dry and visually unengaging. Save the interview only films for educational videos like this one, similar to what we're shooting now, in that there's not a lot of B-roll content there's no B-roll content that's being produced. Although these videos are educational and they're helpful, they're clearly visually unengaging, right? So your supporting content is the spice and the flavor to the interview. Your supporting content can be made up of B-roll or dramatized recreation scenes. So let's spend some time discussing the various forms of supporting content. All right, let's discuss B-roll. Interviews can tend to be a little stagnant. If your entire film was made up of interview footage, the film will have a difficult time connecting with the audience. B-roll is used to bring visual appeal, creativity, and dimension to the story. B-roll will help provide context and visual clarity for the viewer as the interview or the narration progresses. B-roll is where we get to be creative with our shots. When we set out to capture B-roll footage, there are a couple things you're going to want to keep in mind. I mentioned this earlier, but try to capture a variety of wide, medium, and close-up shots of every action or scene that you capture. This is going to provide you with options in your editing process. As you work through your B-roll footage, shoot the shots that you planned for in the pre-production stage and create space to shoot B-roll for the things that arose out of the interview that weren't expected. The interview will almost always shine light on and open up opportunity for expansion in your plan. Make sure that you keep note of the things that spark your interest during the interview that you think would be good B-roll opportunities. The next element of supporting content are drama scenes or recreation scenes. There may be instances where the story you are telling calls for recreation of the scenes discussed in the interview. If you've chosen to tell a docudrama style documentary, this will most certainly be the case. Now, I said this in our pre-production course, but recreating drama scenes where you have your character or actors act out scenes from the story can be difficult for a variety of reasons. First, it does make the filming process more complicated. It can be very expensive to work with actors. It can be also difficult for the subject or character if you're asking them to reenact scenes from a traumatic time in their life. This style of documentary is not to be taken lightly, and it should make absolute sense to tell this kind of story before you enter into a docudrama style project. If you do decide you want to pursue the docudrama style, here are some key points to keep in mind. First, there is no need to be literal in your scenes. Here's what I mean by that. If you're telling a story of a character who was sex trafficked as a child, there's no need to reenact horrifying details of that part of their story. You can communicate that part of the story in an abstract way. For example, you might shoot a scene where the camera is looking over the shoulder of a shady male figure who is watching your character or an actor from afar. This is going to communicate the same thing to the audience. Get creative and a little abstract with these scenes, especially the ones that are especially difficult. We discuss angles and perspectives in pretty good detail in our photography courses, so be sure to check out those courses for a more detailed discussion on this topic. But I do want to revisit angle and perspective and how they relate to video production. Where you place the camera in relation to your subject plays an important role in both photography and film. With video especially, the closer the camera is to the subject, the closer the audience is to the subject, and therefore there will be more intimate connection between the audience and the character. This can serve to emotionally engage your audience really well, but if used poorly or unwisely, can serve to take advantage of your character. Be sure that you have permission to get in close to your subject. If they have not given you that permission, then find another shot. We also want to use this at the right time in the film. If you are tight and in close to your subject for the entire film, and a majority of your shots are close-ups, it's not going to have the same impact as it would if you use these shots sparingly and timely. Save your tight close-up shots for pivotal points in the story, and those shots will have a greater impact on your audience. Also remember to pay attention to where the camera is in relation to the character on a vertical axis. Footage where the camera is pointed down on your subject will give the audience a feeling of superiority and pity. Keep your camera at eye level and then adjust depending on the feel or emotion you're trying to portray. You might want to shoot up at your subject at certain points in the film to make the audience feel like the character is in a position of power. This might serve a film well towards the end where they've seen transformation, they're looking forward to the future. Or you may want to shoot down on your subject during a point in the story where they might feel belittled or trapped in their situation. But don't let that be your default camera position. Keep the camera at eye level unless there is a reason to do otherwise. All right, now I want to spend some time discussing one of the most overlooked parts of the video process in ministry video production, audio. So audio is incredibly important, but it often goes unnoticed and underserved. So great audio goes unnoticed. That's why it's often not taken seriously. But poor audio can ruin a film. Good audio is going to make your film come to life, and it will give your film greater depth. So here are a couple of tips when capturing audio. First, if you can afford to attach a mic to your camera, do so. Don't rely on the mic that is built into your camera. Those microphones are terrible, and audio that they capture won't be very good. I'm fairly confident that all smartphones can capture audio. When you're doing interviews, get a mini lavalier microphone that plugs into your phone and use that to capture audio. If you don't have access to a lavalier mic, record audio into the phone by placing the cell phone as close to the character as possible. It might end up being better audio than the audio picked up by your camera. Now that you've captured audio for your interview, it's time to capture natural sounds audio. This is going to help give the film context and audible depth. If you've got a scene with busy street life, capture the sounds of the hustle and the bustle, cars driving and honking, people walking and talking, birds chirping, and so on. If you've got a scene in the backcountry, capture the sounds from that scene separately from the video footage. River water running, for example, grass blowing in the wind, leaves rustling, etc. Anything that you can layer in the editing process is going to give the audio track depth and life. And lastly, if at all possible, capture local songs from local musicians, local music, and local worship. Have the kids in the community sing songs and record that audio. One of the missing links in ministry video content to this day is music. Most of the time we see Western instrumental worship songs played in the background of a film that wasn't shot in the West. And I think it's a missed opportunity to give cultural depth and context to a film. I referred to a film that will be released soon by World Vision, and I think it's going to change the ministry video scene forever. It's a film where the entire audio track was recorded in country that the film was shot in. And the audio alone in that film makes the viewer feel like they are in country. The power of great audio has on a film is incredible. It can help transport you to a location with great power. Don't neglect audio. Make as much effort as your budget will allow in the audio space, and your film will be better for it. Once again, this is the documentary storytelling process that we follow when we enter into a project. I've made this document available on our website for free, so there's no excuse not to use the resource. This is going to help you guys. It's going to help serve as a guide throughout the filmmaking process. So please use this document to your advantage. Print it out and follow it step by step. It's going to make a huge difference in your production. We've made the document available by clicking on this link in the presentation deck. So if you download the presentation deck, you can get to that resource by clicking on this button. If you're watching this video on YouTube, just go to our website, reliantcreative.org, and download the resource from our downloadable resources page that can be found at the bottom of our website in our footer. And that's all I have for you guys today. This is a list of YouTube links that can help walk you through the topics we've discussed today. Hopefully this list of content can help you research the ideas that we've discussed today further. This presentation deck is available on our website. So if you'd like to schedule a live training of this course, you can do so on our website as well. And then if any point you have additional questions or need help telling your stories or designing communication strategies and content that has purpose and engaging structure, we are always happy to help. This is what we do at Reliant, and we are always looking for new ministry partners to partner with and support. And all the resources that we've discussed today can be found on our website at reliantcreative.org. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to learn the production stage of documentary storytelling. Please don't hesitate to follow up and ask if you have any questions. Again, this is our ministry. This is the way we are using our skills and talents and abilities for the kingdom. So please grant us the opportunity to pour into you so we can tell the stories of how God is working with greater efficiency and effectiveness. Thank you.